A Fortune 500 strategy team spent 6 months and $400,000 building the most beautiful five forces analysis I've ever seen. Every box filled in, every arrow calibrated, every competitive pressure documented with precision. They presented it to the board, and 6 months later, a competitor from an adjacent industry that hadn't been listed because it wasn't in their industry had taken 18% of their best customers. The framework didn't fail them, they failed the framework. And today, I'm going to show you exactly how. Hello, my name is Todd Hagopian, the original Stagnation Assassin and the author of The Unfair Advantage Weaponizing the Hypomanic Toolbox. And today, on Stagnation Assassin MBA, we're cracking open the Porter's Five Forces. I'm going to tell you what they teach in the program and what they leave out and what you actually need to know if you're running a real business in the real world. Here's why this matters right now. Most operators either over rely on five forces as a strategic oracle or dismiss it entirely as academic overhead. Both are completely wrong, and both create stagnation, one through false confidence and the other through strategic blindness. Let's talk about the textbook version of this framework. Here's what the textbook says. And to be fair, it's not wrong. Michael Porter introduced the Five Forces framework in his 1979 Harvard Business Review article and later in Competitive Strategy. The framework argues that the profitability of any industry is determined by five structural forces: the threat of new entrants, the bargaining power of buyers, the bargaining power of suppliers, the threat of substitute products or services, and the intensity of competitive rivalry among existing players. The theory is elegant. The logic holds in a controlled environment. Each force compresses margin from a different direction. High buyer power pushes prices down. High supplier power pushes costs up. New entrants flood supply and dilute returns. Substitutes cap your pricing ceiling. Rivalry forces investment into competitive responses that erode profitability. Porter's core insight was that strategy is not just about beating your direct competitors, it's about managing the structural forces that determine whether your industry is worth competing in at all. That's a genuinely important reframing. The five forces is taught at Harvard, Wharton, Booth, Kellogg as a foundational strategic analysis tool, and for good reason. But let's talk about the real world debrief. Let's talk about what this gets right. This is where the theory actually earns its tuition. When I've used five forces correctly, meaning as a structural diagnostic, not a one time deliverable, it consistently surfaces the profit pressure points that operational teams are too busy to see. At a $500 million division, a five forces analysis made it brutally clear that our supplier concentration was catastrophically high. Two vendors controlled 70% of our critical inputs. That's not procurement problem, that's a strategic vulnerability. The framework is named this with precision. Five forces is also genuinely powerful for capital allocation decisions. If you're deciding whether to enter a market or double down in an existing one, understanding the structural attractiveness of that market before you commit the capital is just not optional. It's the minimum standard of professional management. When applied correctly, it functions a little like the 80/20 matrix with the strategy degree. It helps you identify where the vital few structural advantages live and where you're feeding vampire competitive forces. The framework also performs well as a board level communication tool. It gives executives a shared vocabulary for discussing competitive pressure without getting lost in all the operational detail. But let's go to the operating room. Where does this analysis break down? Here's where the professor sits down and the operator stands up. Porter's five forces is a static snapshot of a dynamic system. It was designed to analyze industry structure as it exists at a point in time. But markets don't hold still for your analysis. They evolve, sometimes slowly and sometimes catastrophically fast. The company I mentioned in the cold open wasn't beaten by a traditional competitor. They were beaten by a platform player from an adjacent space who didn't show up in any of the 5 boxes until it was far too late. This assumption that industry boundaries are fixed and identifiable is where the model meets reality and blinks. There's a second failure mode here, though. The framework measures forces, but doesn't tell you what to do about them. 5 forces is a diagnostic, not a prescriptive framework. Operators under pressure don't need a beautifully labeled diagram with good names of their problems. They need sequenced action. The framework stops exactly where the real work begins. 5 forces tell you the score, but it doesn't tell you how to play. Third, the framework treats all competitive forces as equally manageable. In a real turnaround, they're absolutely not. Some forces, like deeply entrenched buyer power in a commoditized market, can take years to shift. Others, like a specific supplier dependency, can be addressed in 90 days with the right 3 call sequence. The framework doesn't distinguish between these timelines, and that distinction is often the difference between survival and just strategic drift. Finally, the framework is weak on dynamic competition. It doesn't model how forces interact with each other over time, how digital disruption compresses timelines, or how platform economics can collapse entire industry structures overnight. So let's talk about the operator's upgrade. Here's what you actually do with this analysis: run your 5 forces analysis, but then immediately the 80/20 matrix over it. Which force is generating 80% of your margin compression? Go there first. Don't try to address all 5 simultaneously. That's how you get strategic paralysis dressed up as thoroughness. If everything is a strategic priority, then nothing is. Then we're going to assess attack and advance. Assess which force is most structurally compressive. Attack it with focused resource deployment, and then advance to the next one. Sequential pressure beats distributed effort every time. And critically, run this analysis every year, not every strategic planning cycle. Industries don't wait for your 3-year plan. 5 forces should be a living diagnostic, not a laminated wall poster. So the stagnation assassin verdict on this framework: adapt it. Porter's 5 forces is a legitimate strategic tool. The core insight that industry structure determines profitability is empirically supported and operationally valuable. But the static application, the boundary assumption, and the lack of prescription limit its standalone usefulness. So adapt it, use it as your annual structure diagnostic, but layer it with dynamic competitor mapping and immediately translate the output into prioritized action using the 80/20 matrix. That's the version that works in the building, not just in the boardroom. That's Porter's 5 forces for the Stagnation Assassin MBA program. What the textbook built and what the operator needs. For more on how to weaponize frameworks like this in real turnaround situations, pick up The Unfair Advantage, Weaponizing the Hypomanic Toolbox on Amazon. Subscribe to the Stagnation Assassin Show for more MBA programs wherever you get your podcasts, and visit toddhagopian.com and stagnationassassins.com for the world's largest stagnation databases. And remember to continue to